He fired me for being too old. But I never imagined I'd see him again sitting across from me in a suit, nervously interviewing for a job at my new company. In that moment, the power shifted. The man who once crushed my confidence was now asking for my approval. This is the story of how I went from being discarded to being the one holding the pen that could decide his future. And it all started with the job I thought I'd retire from. I had given that company everything. Not just my years, not just my effort, but my identity. My life revolved around it. The building itself felt like a second home. The lobby, with its polished marble floor, the hum of the elevators, the clatter of keyboards echoing through the open-plan office, all of it was familiar, almost comforting. I knew the security guards by name. I knew which vending machines ate your change and which ones always dropped 2 sodas instead of 1. I knew when the cafeteria changed cooks because the soup always tasted different on Thursdays. That place wasn't just where I worked, it was a part of who I was. When I walked through those glass doors every morning, I carried a quiet pride with me. I wasn't some rookie trying to prove myself. I was seasoned, experienced. The guy people came to when things got messy, when deadlines loomed, when clients grew restless. I had history with this company, and for a long time, I believed that history meant something. I believed I had carved out a career I could depend on for the rest of my working life. The kind of career people dream about. The kind of career I thought I'd retire from. And for a while, it seemed like that dream was real. When I first joined, I was the one with the fresh ideas, the energy, the fire. I stayed late to finish projects, eager to prove myself. I said yes to everything. Extra shifts, impossible deadlines, training the new hires who barely knew which button turned on their computers. I did it all. And the recognition came. Managers praised me for my dependability. Colleagues leaned on me because they trusted I wouldn't let them down. I was the safe pair of hands, solid, reliable, someone you could build a team around. I wore that reputation like armor. But what I didn't realize then was that armor can become a cage, because over time, what once felt like praise began to sound like a label. Solid, reliable, dependable. Words that once made me proud slowly turned into words that made me feel old. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was subtle, like a slow leak in a tire you don't notice until you're stranded on the side of the road. It began with small exclusions. A project meeting that I wasn't invited to. A client account I'd handled for years, reassigned to someone younger, someone hungry. At first, I shrugged it off. Everyone gets overlooked now and then. It was worth making noise over. But then it started happening more often. Once became twice. Twice became routine. And routine turned into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Then came the jokes. They weren't cruel at least, not on the surface, just little jabs at lunch. Careful, someone laughed. Don't let him near the new software. He probably still remembers floppy disks. Everyone chuckled, even my boss. And I did what I always did. I forced a laugh, pretending it didn't sting. But inside, it burned. Because what they were really saying was clear. I didn't belong in the future they were building. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just being sensitive. But then the comments started piling up. We need fresh energy. This industry's moving fast, we've got to keep up. It's the younger generation that really understands this market. They weren't even subtle anymore. And every time those words were spoken, my boss would glance at me with this half-smile. The kind of look that didn't need words. The message was loud and clear. You're not fresh. You're not fast. You're not what we need anymore. Still, I kept showing up. Early mornings, late nights, doing more than what was asked. I thought my loyalty had to count for something. Surely they'd remember who had held the line during the tough years, who had kept clients from walking when times were hard. Surely they'd remember that I wasn't just another employee. I was part of the backbone of that company. But loyalty, I would learn, is only valuable until it isn't. One afternoon, I heard it straight from the source. I was walking past the conference room, coffee in hand, when I caught my boss's voice. He didn't know I was there. He was talking to another manager about a new hire. She's got potential, he said. Young, sharp, hungry. We need more people like her. The other manager asked, "And what about him?" There was a pause, a sigh. Then my boss's voice dropped, just low enough to sting. "He's reliable, but let's be honest, Hez getting older. We need a different kind of energy for where we're headed." I froze in the hallway. Those words sliced through me. Not because I hadn't feared them, but because hearing them confirmed everything I'd been trying to deny. In his eyes, my years of loyalty weren't proof of dedication. They were proof of obsolescence. After that, everything changed. Projects I had once led were stripped from me. "Step aside," they'd say. "Let someone else take the lead." Meetings where my voice once carried weight became arenas where my words were brushed off, drowned out by younger, louder voices. I became the shadow in the room, the guy no one listened to anymore. And my boss? He was the ringleader, always polite, always smiling, wrapping his dismissals in silk. "We just want to give others a chance," he'd say. "You've had your time to shine." His words sounded reasonable, but they cut like knives. I can't explain the humiliation of fading into the background of a place you helped build, of walking through the same hallways you once strode with pride and feeling invisible. Like the walls themselves were whispering, "You don't belong here anymore." The worst part? I started to believe it. Every joke, every exclusion, every subtle reminder that I was no longer wanted chipped away at me. I began to doubt myself. Was I really slipping? Was I falling behind? Maybe I was too old. Maybe I didn't belong anymore. And yet, despite the whispers, despite the humiliation, a part of me clung to hope. I told myself they couldn't possibly toss me aside after everything I'd given, that there had to be space for me, that loyalty meant something. But deep down, in the quiet moments when I was honest with myself, I felt it. The axe was coming. And soon. The job I thought I'd retire from was slipping through my fingers, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my boss made his move. And when that day finally came, when he called me into his office, the words he spoke would burn into my memory forever. The day it happened started like any other. I remember that clearly, because that's the cruelest part. Nothing seemed unusual. I woke up, ironed my shirt, grabbed my coffee, and drove to the office the same way I had for years. Same route, same traffic, same parking spot. If I had known what was coming, maybe I would have taken a moment to breathe, to prepare myself. But I didn't know. And so I walked through those glass doors with the same sense of loyalty and routine I had carried for decades. The morning was uneventful. I answered emails, checked in with my team, offered advice to a junior colleague who was struggling with a report. For a brief moment, I felt useful again. Like maybe all the doubts I had been carrying were just in my head. Like maybe I still mattered. That illusion lasted until about 11 a.m. That's when I got the email. Just a short, cold line from my boss as assistant. "Please come to Mr. Anderson's office at noon." My stomach tightened. I'd been in this company long enough to know that kind of email rarely came with good news. Still, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was about restructuring or some client issue. Maybe he needed my input on something important. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but as noon crept closer, I couldn't concentrate. My hands were clammy, my mind running through every possible scenario. By the time I walked down the hall to his office, I already knew. Deep down, I knew. His office door was half open when I arrived, and I could hear his voice. Calm, smooth, professional. He was finishing up a phone call. I stepped inside, and he gestured for me to sit down without breaking his conversation. I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk, staring at the framed awards on the wall, the gleaming diploma behind his head, the family photo of him smiling with his wife and kids. It was all so polished, so perfect. And then I realized I was about to become another detail in his carefully managed career. When he finally hung up, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands like he was about to deliver some great wisdom. "Thank you for coming in," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I nodded, forcing a polite expression. "Of course." He cleared his throat, his tone carefully measured. "You've been with this company a long time. Decades, really. And we all appreciate your service. You've been dependable, loyal, a real asset over the years." It sounded like a eulogy. My heart thudded in my chest. I waited for the word "but," and, sure enough, it came. "But," he continued, "the company is moving in a new direction. The industry is changing rapidly. Clients are demanding fresh ideas, new perspectives. We need to stay competitive, and that means bringing in people who can carry us into the future." There it was. I felt my throat tighten, my palms damp. He was winding up to the punchline. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he was about to share a secret. "You've done great work. But the truth is, you're just too old for where we're headed." Too old. 2 words. That's all it took to shatter decades of loyalty. I stared at him, speechless. My mind screamed that it wasn't legal, that it wasn't fair, that I should fight back. But in that moment, I couldn't find the words. My boss, this man I had worked under, supported, and trusted, was looking me in the eye and telling me I no longer mattered. Not because of my performance, not because of mistakes, but because of my age. He kept talking, filling the silence with empty justifications. "It's nothing personal. It's just business. We need new blood. We'll be restructuring your department, and unfortunately, your position is being eliminated. HR will walk you through the details." I barely heard him. My ears buzzed, my chest heavy. The humiliation washed over me in waves. Too old. That's what he saw when he looked at me. No experience, not wisdom, not decades of loyalty. Just a number, past its expiration date. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking. "So, that's it? After all these years, you're just discarding me?" He sighed, his expression flat. "I know it's hard to hear, but we have to make tough decisions for the future of the company. You should take this as an opportunity. Maybe it's time to slow down, enjoy life, spend time with your family." His words felt like a slap, as if being cast aside was some kind of gift, as if unemployment were a vacation. I clenched my fists in my lap, trying to hold myself together. "You're making a mistake," I said quietly. He gave me that smug half-smile I'd grown to hate. "Maybe, but it's a decision that's already been made." And with that, he stood, signaling the meeting was over. My career, my second home, my sense of purpose was over in a matter of minutes. HR was waiting outside, as if they had rehearsed the whole thing. a folder of paperwork, a carefully worded severance package, a list of instructions for returning company property. They spoke in soft voices, the way people do at funerals, like they were afraid of waking the dead. I barely heard them. My hands moved automatically, signing where they told me, nodding when they explained my benefits. But my mind was elsewhere. As I gathered my things from my desk, my coworkers avoided eye contact. A few offered awkward goodbyes, pats on the back, but most just kept their heads down. No one wanted to be associated with me. I wasn't just unemployed. I was contagious. Walking out of that building for the last time was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The same glass doors I had walked through with pride for decades now felt like the gates of a prison I was being pushed out of. I stepped into the sunlight, clutching a cardboard box of my belongings, and felt the weight of humiliation crush me. Too old. That's all I was now. I had walked into that office believing I still mattered, and I walked out branded with two words that echoed in my head. Too old. Losing the job hurt more than I can describe, but what came after, the rejection, the silence, the endless nights of doubt that nearly broke me. Losing the job was like having the floor ripped out from under me. One day I was somebody, the next I was nothing. I had spent years believing that my position was secure, that loyalty and hard work built an unshakable foundation. But walking out of that building with a cardboard box in my arms, I realized how fragile it all was. Decades of service could be reduced to a single sentence. You're too old. At first, I told myself I'd bounce back quickly. I had experience. I had skills. I had a track record anyone could respect. Surely another company would see my value. That's what I kept repeating in my head as I sat at my kitchen table that first week, updating my RSM, polishing my LinkedIn profile, writing cover letters until my eyes burned. I convinced myself that this was just a temporary setback, a bump in the road. But the world outside wasn't kind. The first few applications I sent out felt hopeful. I'd sit by the computer, refreshing my email every hour, waiting for responses that never came. Days turned into weeks. The silence was deafening. And when replies finally trickled in, they came in the form of polite rejections. Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. I lost account of how many times I read those words. I tried to stay positive, but the interviews were worse. Sitting across from hiring managers half my age, I could feel their eyes scanning me, sizing me up. They'd smile politely, ask about my experience, nod as I explained my history. But I could see the hesitation in their faces. They'd ask questions loaded with subtext. Are you comfortable with new technologies? Do you think you can keep up with a fast-paced environment? They didn't have to say the words. I knew what they were thinking. I was too old. The rejection wore me down. Every time I put on my best suit and walked into another interview, I carried a little less confidence than the time before. Every rejection stripped me of something. Not just opportunities, but dignity. My confidence cracked, piece by piece, until I barely recognized the man in the mirror. At home, the silence was heavier. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How long would my savings last? What would people think of me? Who was I without that job? I felt like I had been erased. Even my family noticed the change. My wife tried to be supportive. She'd remind me of my worth, tell me I was more than my career. But I could see the worry in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. My kids, grown and living their own lives, would call and ask how I was doing. I'd lie and tell them I was fine, but inside I felt like a failure. The shame followed me everywhere, running into old colleagues at the grocery store, seeing their forced smiles, their pitying looks. "How are things?" they'd ask, their voices too soft, too careful. I hated those conversations. I hated the way people looked at me differently now, like I had lost not just my job, but my place in the world. I tried to distract myself. I read books, went for long walks, threw myself into household projects I had put off for years. But no matter what I did, that voice in my head kept repeating the same two words. Too old. It echoed through everything I touched, everything I tried. It was as if my boss had branded me, and I couldn't scrub it off. The financial pressure only made it worse. Bills didn't stop just because I was unemployed. I watched the savings account dwindle, the safety net shrinking faster than I expected. Every rejection letter wasn't just an emotional blow. It was a reminder that time was running out. The fear of losing everything gnawed at me. Months passed. My world shrank to the size of my computer screen and the inbox that rarely lit up. Friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. People moved on, and I was stuck, drowning in my own silence. And then came the lowest moment. I was sitting in the living room one night, staring at the television but not really watching. My wife sat beside me, her hand on mine, her eyes filled with worry she couldn't hide anymore. She said softly, "I miss you. I miss the man who used to laugh, who used to have hope." That broke me, because she was right. I wasn't myself anymore. I had let the humiliation consume me. I had let one man's words define me, and that realization hit harder than any rejection letter. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. The house was silent, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator. I stared at the stack of rejection letters, the unfinished applications, the empty coffee mug beside me, and, for the first time, I admitted the truth out loud. I can't keep living like this. Saying it didn't solve anything, but it cracked something open inside me. Because once I admitted how broken I felt, I also admitted that I had a choice. I could keep drowning in shame, or I could fight. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't let it too old be the last chapter of my story. And as if the universe had been waiting for that moment, the very next day the phone rang. A friend I hadn't spoken to in months was calling. He told me about a company he'd just joined, a place that was growing fast, a place that needed experienced people who could balance out their young, ambitious staff. He said, "You should apply. They'd be lucky to have you." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I had been crushed, humiliated, and nearly broken, but that phone call lit a spark in me. For the first time since losing my job, I saw a path forward. That one call changed everything. It set me on the road to rebuilding my life, and eventually, it brought me face to face with the man who had thrown me away. That phone call felt like a lifeline thrown into dark waters. For months, I had been sinking, weighed down by rejection and silence, and suddenly here was a rope dangling in front of me. I still remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. My friend's voice spilling hope into a life that had been running dry. He told me about this new company he had joined, how it was filled with energy, ambition, and growth. But unlike the place I had just left, this company also respected balance. They valued fresh ideas, yes, but they also valued experience. They wanted people who could steady the ship when the waves hit hard. People who had been through storms before. People like me. I didn't want to get my hopes up too high. Hope had betrayed me too many times already. After so many rejections, disappointment had become my new normal. But something in my gut told me this was different. My friend didn't just say, "You should apply." He said, "They'd be lucky to have you." Those words echoed in my head long after I hung up the phone. For the first time in months, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, someone might still see value in me. The very next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a renewed sense of purpose. The surface was cluttered with rejection letters, coffee stains, and the wreckage of sleepless nights. But that day, it became my command center. I opened my laptop and started tailoring my R-Sum, not just listing jobs, but rewriting the story of who I was. I stopped framing myself as the dependable old hand and started highlighting what that really meant. I was someone who could take chaos and make order, someone who could lead through crisis, someone who could train the next generation and make them stronger. I sweated over every line, every word. I rewrote my cover letter 3 times, each draft sharper than the last, until finally, with my heart pounding, I hit send. That tiny click felt like throwing a bottle into the ocean. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but at least I had given myself a chance. The wait was torture. Every morning, I'd sit with my coffee and refresh my email like a ritual, my heart leaping whenever a new notification appeared. Most of the time, it was spam or bills. But then, a week later, there it was, the message I had been waiting for. They wanted to interview me. I read the email once, then again and again, afraid that if I blinked, it would vanish. I called my wife into the room, and when I showed her, her eyes filled with tears. Not of sadness, but of relief. We hugged in the kitchen, holding on as if we were both afraid the moment might slip away. That night, we celebrated with takeout and the cheapest bottle of champagne we could find. And for the first time in months, laughter filled the house. Still, the fear was there. What if I blew it? What if they took one look at me and saw the same thing my old boss had seen? Someone past his prime. Someone outdated. Someone who didn't belong. That fear whispered in my ear as I ironed my shirt the night before the interview. It whispered as I polished my shoes, as I tied my tie, as I sat in the lobby of that new company waiting for my name to be called. When the interview started, I expected the same careful smiles, the same doubtful questions I had grown used to. But what I got instead was something entirely different. They listened, really listened. When I spoke about my past projects, they didn't glance at the clock or shuffle papers. They leaned forward, curious. When I explained how I handled challenges, their eyes lit up, and they asked follow-up questions. And when I admitted, with honesty, that I had been let go from my previous job, they didn't frown or look uncomfortable. They nodded, like they understood exactly what I had been through. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. Felt like I was being seen. Not as someone too old for the job, but as someone seasoned enough to bring real value to the table. I left that building walking taller than I had in months. The call came 2 days later. I got the job. The words hit me like thunder. "We'd like to officially welcome you to the team." My knees nearly buckled. My wife grabbed the phone out of my hands just to hear it herself, and when she hung up, she wrapped her arms around me. "See?" she whispered. "I told you it wasn't over. Starting at the new company wasn't easy. I won't pretend it was." On my first day, I walked into an office buzzing with young faces, their energy crackling in the air. They spoke quickly, moved quickly, and thought quickly. For a moment, I felt like an intruder, the outsider, the old man in the room. The same insecurity I had been branded with at my old job flared up again. Would they dismiss me before I even had the chance to prove myself? But slowly, those fears faded. Because while my coworkers had energy, I had perspective. When they ran into problems, I didn't panic. I had seen enough in my career to know that most storms could be weathered with patience and planning. When projects started spinning out of control, I had the calm to steer them back on track. And when deadlines loomed, I wasn't afraid to roll up my sleeves and grind through the hard hours right alongside them. Something amazing happened. They started coming to Menot because I had a title that forced them to, but because they trusted me. They valued my advice, my guidance, my steady hand. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt essential again. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, I'd catch myself staring into the mirror, wondering if history would repeat itself. Would someone in this company eventually look at me the way my old boss had too old, too slow, too stuck in the past? That fear never fully disappeared. But every day that I showed up and proved myself, every day that my coworkers treated me with respect, that fear grew quieter. Weeks turned into months. My confidence came back, piece by piece. I found myself laughing again, sharing stories, mentoring new hires who reminded me of myself decades ago. Slowly, I started to believe that maybe my career wasn't over. Maybe this wasn't just a second chance, it was a new beginning. The turning point came during a team meeting one Friday afternoon. We were reviewing a project that had nearly fallen apart, and I had been the one to help salvage it. My manager turned to the group and said, "This project would have collapsed without him. His experience saved us." The room erupted in applause. My face burned, but in the best way. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an afterthought. I felt seen, respected, needed. That moment stayed with me, because it wasn't just about applause, it was about validation. It was proof that age didn't erase value, that wisdom mattered, that loyalty, hard work, and resilience still had a place in the world. I carried that moment like a shield. I thought I had found closure. I thought my story had come full circle, that I had been broken and rebuilt, and that was the end of it. But life, as I was about to learn, wasn't done writing chapters for me. Because one morning, months after I had settled into my new role, HR announced we'd be interviewing for a new management position. They said candidates were already lined up. I walked into the interview panel ready to meet strangers, ready to evaluate resumes and test leadership skills. But when I looked across the room, my blood ran cold. Sitting nervously in a chair, clutching his arsum, waiting to be called in, was a face I thought I'd never see again. It was him, the man who had fired me for being too old. The same man who had tossed me aside like I was worthless was now waiting for me to decide if he deserved a second chance. I had rebuilt my life, regained my dignity, and finally felt whole again. But nothing prepared me for the moment when my past walked back into my present. The man who had once ended my career was now about to sit across from me, not as my boss, but as a desperate candidate asking for approval. By the time that interview day arrived, I had already built a new life within my new company. The months leading up to it had been some of the most challenging, but also the most rewarding of my entire career. I had walked in carrying the scars of rejection, the label of too old stamped on my back, but slowly, brick by brick, I rebuilt not only my reputation but my sense of self. I wasn't just an employee anymore. I was part of a culture that valued me, that listened when I spoke, that trusted my judgment. My desk wasn't tucked in a corner like it had been at the end of my old job. Instead, I was seated among the team, right in the middle of the energy and creativity, where ideas bounced around like sparks. My voice wasn't ignored in meetings, it was asked for. When I spoke, people didn't glance at their phones or shuffle papers. They leaned forward and took notes. And it wasn't just about the respect. It was about the connection. My coworkers weren't afraid of me or dismissive of me. They came to me for advice, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When a project stalled, I was the one they asked for guidance. When someone struggled with a client, they'd tap on my door and say, "Can I get your perspective?" And each time, I felt a small piece of myself stitch back together. I became a mentor without even realizing it. Younger employees started stopping by my desk not just for work questions, but for life advice. One asked how I balanced my career and family. Another asked how I handled failure when I was starting out. Those questions reminded me that my experience wasn't baggage, it was value. The wisdom I carried wasn't outdated, it was timeless. But even as I found my rhythm again, the scars from my old boss's words never fully faded. Late at night, I'd sometimes sit at my desk long after everyone had gone home, staring at the glow of my computer screen, and the phrase would creep back into my mind. Too old. It was like a shadow trailing behind me. I kept waiting for someone in this company to eventually see me the same way. For someone to pull me aside and say, "Thank you for your work, but we need younger blood." That fear was always there, whispering. But then the recognition started coming. My manager praised me openly. Senior leaders noted the stability I brought to the team. When a major project nearly collapsed, it was I who pulled it back from the brink, and everyone saw it. I earned not just respect, but trust. And with every success, that shadow grew smaller. I remember one particular meeting vividly. We were discussing strategies for expanding into a new market. The room was buzzing with ideas, some good, some reckless. People were excited, but they were also rushing, ready to gamble. I listened quietly until the energy started spiraling into chaos. And then I spoke up. My voice was calm, measured, but firm. I pointed out risks they hadn't considered, offered strategies they hadn't thought of, and reminded them that sometimes moving carefully was more powerful than moving fast. The room went quiet. Then my manager nodded and said, "That's exactly what we needed to hear." The plan shifted instantly, built on the foundation of my words. In that moment, I knew I had truly earned my place. It was around this time that HR announced they were hiring for a new management role. The position was important, someone who would oversee a growing department, someone who could shape the culture as we expanded. The company wanted people from both inside and outside to apply, so the interview panel would be a mix of senior leaders and trusted employees. To my surprise, I was asked to sit on that panel. At first, I felt honored. Being chosen meant they trusted my judgment, that they valued my perspective not just as a worker, but as a leader. But the honor quickly twisted into shock when I saw the list of candidates, because sitting among those names was one I recognized instantly, a name I could never forget. My old boss, the man who had looked me in the eye and said I was too old for his future. The man who had stripped me of my dignity, discarded me like an outdated machine, and left me to drown in silence and shame. He was applying to work here, at my new company, and not just in any role, but in management. I felt my chest tighten as I read the name again, making sure my eyes weren't playing tricks. But it was there, in bold letters. He was coming. In the days leading up to the interviews, I couldn't shake the irony. I remembered the way he smirked across his desk, telling me I was past my prime. I remembered the humiliation of packing my things into a cardboard box while my coworkers avoided my eyes. I remembered walking out of those glass doors with my life in pieces. And now, here he was, preparing to walk through the doors of my new beginning. The morning of the interviews, I arrived early. I wanted time to gather myself, to steady my nerves, because I knew that eventually I would have to sit across from him, and I couldn't let old wounds control me. I had to stay composed, professional, strong. As the candidates arrived, the lobby filled with nervous energy. Young professionals in sharp suits, clutching folders, practicing their answers in hushed tones. And then, through the glass doors, he walked in. It was surreal. Time hadn't changed him much. He still wore the same perfectly pressed suit, the same polished shoes, the same smug expression. Though this time I noticed cracks in it. He glanced around the lobby, trying to mask his nerves, his eyes darting like a man who wasn't used to being on the other side of the table. He was holding his arsum a little too tightly, his jaw set a little too hard. For a moment, I just stared. Memories rushed back like a flood. The words, the laughter, the silence, the shame. My heart pounded. My palms went sweaty. Part of me wanted to walk out, to avoid him entirely. But another part of me, stronger, steadier, stood its ground. This was my company now, my home, and he was just another candidate. He looked up, and for a second our eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face, followed quickly by something else, surprise, maybe even discomfort. He hadn't expected to see me here. Not like this. Not in a position of authority. The irony hit me like a wave. The man who had once judged me unworthy was now about to ask for my approval. The same voice that had told me I was too old would now have to convince me that he still had something to offer. The tables hadn't just turned, they had flipped entirely. I leaned back in my chair as HR called the first candidate into the interview room, my mind already racing with the questions I would ask when his turn came. Questions that would cut deeper than he expected. Questions that would expose who he really was. But even as my heart thundered in my chest, I knew I had to play this right. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about humiliating him the way he had humiliated me. This was about justice, about truth, about showing him and myself that I was never too old. And so I waited, calm on the outside, burning on the inside, as the names were called one by one, because I knew that sooner or later his name would echo through that hallway, and he would walk into the room where everything had changed. I had risen in my new company, rebuilt my identity, and earned respect. But nothing compared to the moment I realized the man who had once fired me was now about to sit across from me. Not as my superior, but as a desperate candidate. The interview room was ready, the panel was seated, and when his name was finally called, the past and present collided in a way I'll never forget. The door opened, and HR called his name. For a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. My chest tightened as I watched him rise from his seat in the lobby, smooth the front of his suit jacket, and walk toward us. He moved with the same air of confidence I remembered, shoulders back, chin lifted, every step measured like a performance. But I noticed something new, a stiffness in his gait, the way his hand lingered just a little too long on the doorknob, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't the untouchable figure he had once been. He wasn't my boss anymore. He was just another candidate. When he stepped inside, his gaze swept across the panel with the charm of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. And then his eyes found me. The transformation was instant. His smile froze. His confident posture faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. I watched as recognition struck him like a slap. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, the faint flare of his nostrils. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me sitting at the table, holding a pen, my nameplate resting in front of me. Authority, power, the very things he had once stripped away from me. He tried to recover, forcing a smile. "Well," he said, his voice a little too smooth, "this is unexpected." I returned the smile, calm and steady. "Yes," I said evenly, "unexpected." My voice didn't waver. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like a drumbeat in my ears, but I refused to let him see it. HR gestured for him to take a seat, and he lowered himself into the chair across from us. The same type of chair I had once sat in, waiting for his approval, dreading his judgment. Now the roles were reversed. The interview began the way most do. The first panelist asked him to talk about his experience, his leadership style, and the highlights of his career. He spoke smoothly, polished and professional, just like I remembered. He leaned into his confidence, his practiced charisma, his rehearsed answers about efficiency and vision. To anyone else in the room, he probably seemed impressive, but not to me. I had seen behind the curtain. I knew the man beneath the performance. As he answered questions about handling conflict, about building teams, I watched closely. I studied the little details, the way he smoothed his tie when he was nervous, the way his eyes darted to the corners of the room when he was searching for words. He wasn't as bulletproof as he once seemed. There were cracks now. Finally, the moment came. My turn. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. My voice was calm but firm. "Tell us," I began, "about a time you had to make a difficult decision that affected people's careers. How did you handle it?" The room went silent. He glanced at me, just for a moment, and I saw the flicker in his eyes. He knew what I was really asking. He knew I hadn't forgotten. He cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "Well," he said, forcing composure, "leadership often requires making tough calls. Sometimes those decisions aren't popular, but they're necessary for the greater good of the company. Polished, rehearsed, empty." I didn't look away. I held his gaze until his voice wavered just slightly. Then I spoke again. "And what about regret? Have you ever made a decision you wish you could take back?" The air in the room grew heavier. My colleagues on the panel glanced at each other, sensing the undercurrent, but not yet understanding its depth. He hesitated. Just a flicker, but I saw it. Then he plastered on his practiced smile. "Of course, every leader has regrets. We're all human. But I believe in accountability. When mistakes are made, you own them, you learn from them, and you move forward." Accountability. The word echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. I remembered sitting in his office, listening as he told me I was too old, watching him wash his hands of me like I was nothing more than paperwork to be filed away. Accountability was the last thing he had ever shown me. I tilted my head slightly. "So, when your decisions cost someone their livelihood, do you truly believe moving forward is enough? Or do you ever think about the people you left behind?" His smile faltered. For the first time, he didn't have a polished answer ready. He shifted in his seat, his hand tightening around his arsum. I believe in making decisions for the greater good," he said finally. "Not everyone will agree, but leaders have to see the bigger picture." I let the silence stretch, long enough for him to feel the weight of the words, long enough for the rest of the panel to sense that there was history here, a story unspoken. The other panelists continued with their questions, but the atmosphere had shifted. He was rattled now. His answers grew shorter, his confidence thinner. He wasn't the commanding figure I had once known. He was just a man trying to hold on to an image that was crumbling at the edges. When the interview finally wound down, he rose from his chair. He smoothed his jacket, forced another smile, and nodded to the panel. "Thank you for your time," he said. But his eyes found mine again, and in them I saw something I had never seen before. Not superiority, not smugness, not control. Fear. As he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him, I sat in silence for a moment, my pen motionless in my hand. A storm of emotions swirled inside Minger, vindication, even a strange sense of pity. But above all, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. The man who had once fired me for being too old had just sat across from me, desperate for approval, and in that moment I realized I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to humiliate him the way he had humiliated me. The fact that he had walked into this room, hat in hand, while I sat on the other side of the table, that was victory enough. Still, the decision wasn't mine alone. The panel would deliberate. We would weigh his qualifications, his answers, and his demeanor. We would decide whether he deserved a place in this company. And part of me couldn't help but wonder, what would I do when the time came to cast my vote? Would I show him mercy, or would I show him what it felt like to be discarded? Either way, one thing was certain. The tables had turned, and the choice was no longer his. It was mine. The man who had once ended my career had now sat across from me, exposed and vulnerable, and the decision about his future was no longer his, it was mine. But what happened after the interview shocked even me, because when the panel deliberated, the truth about who he really was finally came to light. Every interview panel has a rhythm. Some questions are easy icebreakers, meant to put the candidate at ease. Others dig deeper, probing for strategy, skill, or vision. Each panelist has a role, and mine was clear. I was there to ask about values. I was the one who focused on people, on culture, on how a leader makes employees feel. I had done it countless times before, but this time was different. This time, the man across the table was the same man who once told me I was too old to matter. He had handled the earlier questions well enough. He always did. He leaned into his polished answers, weaving in buzzwords like innovation, scalability, and synergy. To someone who didn't know him, he might have sounded convincing, even impressive. But I knew better. I had once admired that same charm, mistaking it for true leadership. I had once believed his words, only to learn the hard way that they were nothing more than a veneer. As the questions rotated around the table, I felt my heartbeat quicken. My turn was coming. I thought back to that day in his office, the polished desk between us, the cold smile on his face, the words that had shattered me. "You're just too old for where we're headed." I had walked out humiliated, carrying a cardboard box filled with the remnants of my career. And now, here we were. When my turn arrived, I leaned forward. My voice was calm, professional, but beneath the surface, my pulse was pounding. This wasn't just another question. This was my chance to hold up a mirror, to strip away the mask he had worn for so long. "Thank you for your responses so far," I began, keeping my tone even. "I'd like to ask you something that often gets overlooked in leadership interviews. In your view, what's the best way to support employees of different ages and backgrounds, especially older employees who may bring decades of experience to the table?" The words landed like a thunderclap. For a split second, silence filled the room. His eyes flicked toward me, and I caught at the hesitation, the crack in his polished exterior. He hadn't expected this question, certainly not from me. He forced a smile, though his cheeks flushed slightly. "Well," he began, drawing out the word as if buying time, "I believe in creating a culture where everyone has a voice. Of course, fresh perspectives are critical in today's market, but experience has its place too. Balance is key." It was a safe answer, carefully crafted but hollow. I'd heard it before. Id lived the opposite. I didn't let him off the hook. "Could you give us an example?" I asked, my voice steady but sharpened. "A specific time when you advocated for an older employee, or made sure their value was recognized." This time, he froze. His polished mask slipped for half a heartbeat, long enough for everyone in the room to notice. He let out a small laugh, the kind that was meant to lighten the mood, but only made his discomfort more obvious. "Well, I can't recall a specific instance right now," he said, fumbling. "But I've always encouraged teamwork. Age doesn't matter if everyone contributes equally." It was weak. Too weak. I caught the panelists' reactions from the corner of my eye. One raised an eyebrow, another tilted their head, one scribbled something quickly in their notes. They saw it too, the cracks in his armor. I leaned in further, refusing to let him escape. "Let me clarify. Many workplaces say they value experience, but in practice they sideline older employees, sometimes subtly, sometimes not. How would you ensure that doesn't happen here?" This time, the color drained from his face. His smile collapsed entirely. He shifted in his chair, fumbling with the papers in front of him. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw recognition not just of the question, but of me. He knew why I was asking. He knew what memory I was pulling to the surface. He stammered, his words losing their polish. I suppose it comes down to respect," he said finally. "Yes, respect. Everyone deserves that. Of course, companies have to make tough choices sometimes. But yes, treating people with respect is important." Important. That was the best he could muster. A word that sounded more like an afterthought than a conviction. I sat back slowly, folding my hands in my lap, and let the silence hang in the air. It was heavy, deliberate, and he felt every second of it. My colleagues didn't need me to spell anything out. They had seen him stumble. They had seen the flush in his cheeks, the tremor in his voice, the collapse of confidence that followed a question he should have answered with ease if his values were genuine. The rest of the panel carried on, but the atmosphere had shifted. He was unraveling now. His answers grew shorter, less polished. The charm he had leaned on for so long no longer carried the same weight. His rehearsed phrases fell flat against the memory of his stumble. The faade was cracking, and everyone could see it. As the final questions wrapped up, he gathered his notes with trembling fingers. He forced a smile as he stood, but it no longer carried the same smugness. His eyes flicked to mine one last time, and in them I saw what I had waited years to see. Not superiority, not confidence, not control. Fear. When the door closed behind him, the room was silent for a long moment. One of the panelists finally broke the quiet. That was interesting. Another shook their head slightly, jotting down more notes. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The question I had asked had done the work for me. His hypocrisy had been laid bare not just to me, but to everyone who mattered. Inside, I felt a swell of emotions. Anger, vindication, relief, but above all, validation. The man who once told me I was too old to matter had just crumbled under the weight of a single question. And this time, it was my reputation on the line, it was his. His hypocrisy was exposed, his confidence shattered. For years, he had held power over me. But today, in front of an entire panel, the truth revealed itself. The man who once dismissed me as too old had shown that he was the one out of touch, the one unfit to lead. But the final verdict wasn't mine to deliver, it was the company's. And when the panel deliberated, the truth about his future was decided once and for all. When the door shut behind him, the tension in the room lingered like a storm that had just passed. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and for a moment no one spoke. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded, my gaze fixed on the folder in front of me. I didn't want to be the first to speak. I wanted to hear what the others had seen. Finally, one of the senior panelists leaned back in their chair and exhaled. "Well," she said slowly, "that was complicated." Another nodded. "His sum is strong, no doubt about it." But something about his answers. He trailed off, frowning at his notes. I kept quiet, but inside I was burning. I could still hear his hesitation, the forced laugh, the stammer when I pressed him about valuing older employees. He had been exposed, not just to me, but to them. The discussion began. One panelist pointed to his past titles, the leadership roles he'd held, the projects he claimed to have managed successfully. On paper, she said, he looks like a solid candidate. Another disagreed. Maybe, but he didn't convince me. He came across as arrogant, like he thought this position was already his. I couldn't help but think back to the younger version of myself, sitting in his office, blindsided by his words. "You're just too old for where we're headed." He hadn't thought twice about discarding me, reducing my years of work into a neat little excuse. And now, here he was, hoping this company wouldn't see through the same hollow act I had once fallen for. When it was my turn to speak, I chose my words carefully. I didn't mention the past. I didn't bring up how he had treated me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. What I noticed, I said slowly, was how unprepared he was for questions about values, specifically when it came to recognizing and supporting older employees. That's a crucial part of our culture here. We don't sideline experience, we build on it. And I didn't hear a single concrete example from him. Not one. The room was silent for a moment. Then one of my colleagues nodded. Exactly. He talked in circles. Lots of buzzwords, no substance. Another chimed in, and when he was pressed, he stumbled. That worries me. If he can't handle tough questions in here, how will he handle tough situations out there? The momentum shifted. What started as cautious respect for his sum turned into doubt, then into criticism. Piece by piece, the facade he had tried to maintain crumbled under the weight of collective observation. His lack of authenticity, his arrogance, his dismissiveness, they all rose to the surface. I listened quietly, my heart steady now. I didn't need to push. I didn't need to argue. The truth was doing the work for me. He had revealed himself. The same man who once thought I was disposable was now being measured by the very standards he had ignored, and he was failing. When the vote came, It wasn't even close. One by one, each panelist gave their verdict. Not a fit. Too arrogant. Doesn't align with our values. When it reached me, I looked down at my notes, then up at the others. Agreed, I said simply. My voice didn't shake. It didn't gloat. It was calm, resolute, final. The decision was made. He would not be hired. Just like that, the power he once wielded over me evaporated. Not because I tore him down, not because I exposed our history, but because his own actions, his own words, had betrayed him. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my papers slowly, letting the reality sink in. For years, I had carried the weight of his dismissal, the sting of being told I was too old, the shame of walking out with nothing but a box in my hands. And now, without lifting more than a few deliberate questions, I had watched the tables turn. Walking out of the room, I felt lighter than I had in years. The verdict was sealed. He wasn't going to get the job. He wasn't going to step into this company and repeat the same cycle of arrogance and dismissal. Justice had been delivered, not by revenge, but by his own failure. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because when he realized what had happened, when he understood that he had lost everything, he came looking for me. The panel voted against him. He wasn't hired. Justice wasn't mine alone. It was the company's. But the story didn't end there. Because after the verdict was delivered, he cornered me one last time. The verdict was final. He wasn't getting the job. The panel had made its decision, and the door that he thought would open for him had closed for good. I should have felt relief, maybe even triumph. And in a way, I did. But more than that, I felt something deeper closure. For the first time since the day he fired me, I knew he no longer held any power over my life. I gathered my notes, thanked the other panelists, and left the conference room. My steps were steady, but my mind was racing. Years of hurt and humiliation had led to this moment, and I needed a breath of air to take it all in. I walked down the hallway, my heart lighter than it had been in years. That's when I heard his voice. Wait. I turned, and there he was, standing near the elevators, his tie slightly loosened, his face pale. He looked smaller somehow, like the arrogance that once gave him height had drained away. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Can we talk?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to let the silence speak for itself. But another part of me knew this was it, the final chapter of a story that had haunted me for too long. I nodded once. Say what you need to say. He glanced around, making sure no one else was within earshot. "Look," he began, "I know how that interview went. And I know you had a hand in it. You made me look weak in front of them." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't make you look weak. You did that all on your own." His jaw tightened. It wasn't personal, what happened back then. Let's be honest, it was business. Companies change, markets evolve. I had to make tough calls, and you were just part of that. Just part of that. The words stung, but not like they once would have. Now they sounded pathetic. Excuses from a man grasping for control that wasn't his anymore. "You told me I was too old," I said quietly. "That wasn't business. That was personal." He flinched, as if the memory struck harder than he expected. "Maybe I was too blunt," he muttered. "But I didn't mean to ruin your life. You were good at your job. I respected you. I cut him off. You just thought I didn't matter anymore. You thought years of loyalty and experience could be tossed aside like yesterday's news. You thought I was finished." He opened his mouth, but I kept going, my voice steady, rising just enough to make him listen. And yet, here we are. You came into this building hoping for a new beginning, and you sat across from me the very person you once discarded. Do you know what that tells me? He swallowed hard, his eyes darting away. What? He asked, his voice quieter now. It tells me that I was never the problem. You were. The silence between us was heavy. He looked down, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining out of him. For a moment, he almost seemed human, just a man who had made mistakes, who had believed his own lies for too long. But I didn't feel sorry for him, not anymore. I took a breath, letting the words form slowly, deliberately, each one carrying the weight of everything I had endured. You once told me I was too old to matter, but today proved something you never understood. I wasn't too old. I was too valuable for you to recognize. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. The words hit him like a hammer, and for once he had no comeback, no slick remark, no excuse. Just silence. I stepped past him, pressing the elevator button with a steady hand. The doors opened, and before I stepped inside, I turned back one, last time. That's the difference between us. You tear people down to feel powerful. I build people up, and that's why I'll always move forward, while you're left standing still. The doors slid shut, leaving him on the other side. As the elevator descended, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. For years, his voice had haunted me, his words echoing in my mind, convincing me that I was less than I was. But now, those echoes were gone. I had the last word, the last choice, the last power. And it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. He had once fired me for being too old. But when he showed up to interview at my new company, the world reminded him of something he had long forgotten. Age isn't a weakness. Dismissing experience isn't leadership. And the person you underestimate today might be the one who holds your future tomorrow. I told him calmly, "You once said I was too old to matter, but today proved I was too valuable for you to understand.